The base components that we've created so far are going to be extremely helpful when we designed our UI, and as a result, they're going to be used a little bit everywhere. Every time we need a button or a panel or an icon for a page, we're going to end up registering those components on that page. So I think it makes sense, and it would be a little bit more convenient for them to be available globally. One thing we could do is register them manually on the app.js file. So we could do import base button from components / base button, and then registering by calling view.component base button. And that works. Our base button is now registered globally and does not need to be registered on each page, but we can do better than this. Ideally, I would like any component whose name starts with base to be automatically registered. That way, if in the future we had more base components, we don't need to remember to register them in our app.js file. It will automatically be registered for us. So let me show you. I'm going to comment those 2 lines and write let require context equals require.context component false base any word dot view. Okay, so before I show you how this works, let me show you what that actually returns. So I'm going to do console log require context, and because this is actually a function, let's write dot keys to see what has been included in that context. So if I save this and open the console, you can see that we magically end up with an array of 6 elements, which contains the path of all of our base components. Okay, so now let's see how this works. If I go into the Webpack documentation, you can see that the require.context function accepts 3 arguments. The first one is the directory that contains our components. The second one is a boolean that decides if we want to look for components inside subdirectories. In our case, we don't need that because all of our components are going to be directly in our components folder. And finally, the third argument is a regex expression that should match the path of our components. Okay, so in our case, we're looking for components inside the components directory. We don't need to look into subdirectories. And for the regex expression, we want component that starts with base and finish by .view. So that's why when we run require context.keys, we end up with the path of all of our base components. Okay, so now what we need to do is run view.component for each of those file names. So we'll say require context.keys dot for each file name. And here the goal is to run view.component name component, where name is the name of the component without any slash or without any .view extension, and component is the object that defines our component. So typically the object that contains props, data, computed, methods, etc. Okay, so let's start with name. I'm going to comment that out and write let name equals file name replace. And this is a regex expression that is going to remove anything that is before the last slash. So if I have a/b/foo, it's going to replace that with foo. Next, I'm going to call replace a second time. And that one is simply going to get rid of the extension. So if we have foo.view, it's going to return foo. Okay, so let me show you. If I do console log file name and then name, you can see that we've managed to extract the name of the component from the path of the component. Okay, so that's our first argument done. Next, we need to access the object that defines our component. And we can do that by running let component equals require context file name. As I mentioned earlier, what gets returned by require.context is actually a function that can be used to import the content of a file. So in our case, that's exactly what we need. Let me show you the content of component. So it's a module which has a default key, and that default key is actually the definition of our component. So to access our component definition, we should really add .default here. However, this is because we're using Webpack 4 on the latest version of Laravel Mix. If you're using Webpack 3 and below, then the component definition won't be available on the .default key, but directly at the root of the module. So this will be what you want. So in order to make it work in both cases, let's say component equals component.default. Or if you can't find anything in the default key, just return component. Okay, so now we're finally ready to call our view.component method, because we have our name, which has already been passed, and our component that has been required from the required context. Before we test that out, there is one last thing that I want to tweak. Sometimes the name of a component is defined on the component definition itself. So in the objects where you have all of your props, your computed property, etc., you can also define name equals and then whatever you want. So in our case, that would be base button, for example. And when that's the case, we want to register the component using that name instead of passing the file name. And we can do that very easily by saying component.name or name. So if the component has a name property, then use that. Otherwise, use the name that we've passed from the file name. Okay, so let's finally test this out. I'm going to remove those comments and go to our app.view component and remove all of these import statements, as well as all of that component object. So now if I save this and go back to our paparazzi application, you can see that all of the components are still working fine, still displaying as they should, and we didn't need to import them manually. We can even go to our base button component and remove the import statements that imports the icon. So this and this. And it still works absolutely fine. Now, before wrapping this video and this module, I'd like to do a little bit of refactoring. So if we go back to our app.js file, I'd like to export all of this into a custom-made Vue plugin. So I'm going to cut all of that code and create a new base components.js plugin inside a plugins folder. Now, plugins in Vue.js are very simple. All you need to do is export an object that has an install function. So install Vue and then whatever you want here. So this function is our opportunity to improve on the Vue instance and register all of those components dynamically. So I'm going to paste our code here and update the path of our components directory. Next, because I'm planning on having multiple plugins in this course, I'm going to create a plugins/index.js file. And that file is simply going to return a function that takes care of registering all of our plugins for us. So let's start by importing our base components plugin. And we'll export a function that calls vue.useBaseComponents. Now we can use that function in our app.js file. So this is where we'll register plugins. We'll import that function that we'll call register plugins from the plugins directory and the index file. And because the file is called index, we don't need to specify it. Next, all we need to do is actually call that register plugin function and provide the Vue instance to it. So register plugin Vue, and if I save that, all of our base components are back. Okay, one last thing. I'm a big fan of Webpack aliases, and because we've created a new plugins directory, I think it's a good opportunity for us to create a new plugins alias. So let's go to our Webpack config file and add a new alias here. So we copy that. And instead of components, this will be plugins. And because we've created an index.js file that kind of abstracts the whole plugin ecosystem, we can add a $, here. And that $, makes sure that we don't access anything further than the plugins directory. So without the $, we could do @plugins/foobar. But with the $, this will result in an error. So all you can do is @plugins. This is not mandatory, but I like to add a $sign whenever I create an index.js file. And that's because when I create an index.js file, it creates an encapsulation of what's in that folder, and I don't want myself to bypass that encapsulation in the future. Okay, so let's have a quick recap and see what we've implemented in this episode. We've created our first plugins called base components that automatically registers all of our base components in our Vue instance. We created an index.js file inside the plugins directory that encapsulates the entire plugins ecosystem. And we've initialized that plugin ecosystem on our app.js file. We've also created an alias for the plugins ecosystem that we're actually not using here. So let's fix that real quick. We'll go to our app.js file and do @plugins. And I need to restart hot reloading for it to work. So npm run hot. Okay, so as I was saying, we created a new alias for the plugins directory that we define on our Webpack configuration file. Finally, we removed all of the import statements that are now no longer necessary from our app.vue component and our base button.vue component. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this module. We are now fully prepared to implement the design of our frontend, which will be the goal of our next module.